Hello, boys and girls. Today we are going to review 4 types of genres that we have learned so far in school. To review, a genre is a specific type of music, film, or writing. Examples are fiction, biography, nonfiction, and myths. The 4 types of genre that we have learned are fairy tales, fables, informational, and fantasy. Let's review those 4. Fantasy. So the genre of fantasy means that the story is going to be made up. We say that that is a fictional story. So a fantasy is a fictional story that includes elements that are impossible. So for example, Harry Potter, that's a fantasy. There's no such thing as wizards and magic. Those type of story elements are impossible, which means that story is going to be a fantasy. We read a few stories that are fantasy genres. Let's review one of the stories that was a fantasy. Curious George at School was an example of a fantasy. If you remember, the monkey, George, ends up going to school. That is not something that could possibly happen in real life. That means this story is a fantasy. Another genre that we've learned about is a fairy tale. A fairy tale is a fictional story that includes magic, magical creatures, or magical lands. So when we read The 3 Little Pigs on e-learning day, that was an example of a fairy tale. It was a story that was made up with creatures that could not really do those things in real life. Let's look at another popular example of a fairy tale. Cinderella is a really good example of a fairy tale. This story is a fairy tale because it has made up creatures, mice that can talk, and a fairy godmother that can change pumpkins into carriages. Another genre we've talked about is a fable. A fable is a story that teaches a lesson called a moral. Remember, boys and girls? A fable teaches a lesson. A fable teaches a lesson. So we read Jack and the Wolf. That was an example of a fable. The Hare and the Tortoise, that was also a fable. It's a story that teaches a lesson. Jack and the Wolf was a fable because we learned that Jack called wolf or cried wolf way too many times and he was tricking his friends. We learned that tricking is never the right thing to do. The last genre that we discussed was an informational text. Informational texts are non-fiction stories that give facts about real people, things, and events. And they usually include text and graphic features that tell information beyond the text. We also talked about how informational text will usually include real pictures. We call those photographs taken with a camera. And that usually will help aid in giving those real facts about real things or people or events. Lucia's Neighborhood was a great example of an informational text. This story had real photographs about real people, and it told us facts about Lucia's neighborhood and things that we could find in her neighborhood. Remember, boys and girls, that a genre is a type of story. And it's always wonderful to learn about the genre of a story before you read. This helps get your brain ready and it helps you know what kind of story you're going to be reading about. So remember what a nonfiction story is, an informational text, a fairy tale, a fable, and a fantasy. Thanks for listening.